Cypress Valley Bible Church. I'm certainly happy to be with you. If I haven't met you before, I'm Lucas Kitchen, and I fill in every once in a while here. So today we're talking about stressed because of marriage. And if you're married, I'm going to say you definitely can relate to this. But even if you're not married, my guess is that you've been touched in some way by a stressed out marriage. Whether it was your parents, aunt and uncle, someone you love has a stressed out marriage, and it's a little difficult to be around it. And what we learned today, I think, can help in all of those types of situations. Now, one of the reasons why marriage can be such a stressful place is because husbands and wives are so different, right? And in fact, yesterday, my Saturday, illustrated a few differences between my wife and I, and I'd like to tell them to you, although I can't remember if I told Krista that I'm going to tell you about this, but it's nothing bad. So I was weed eating yesterday, just, for some reason, it's just in my DNA to get the yard weed eated. I hate doing it, but I do it anyway. And I was weed eating by the barbed wire fence, and as I was weed eating, I felt something about like that. I looked down, and there was a rusty metal shard sticking out of the side of my shoe. Now, I didn't wear my big boots this day. I was just wearing my walking shoes, and so it went right through the cloth, and luckily, it hit bone, so it couldn't go in too deep. It just hit the bone of my foot. So I yanked it out, and I took my shoe off, and I said, it's not bleeding too much. I got about half the yard to do. Let's go ahead and finish it up, right? I mean, I'm not going to stop if I can continue. It's just what you got to do. You just have to. But I went in the house, and I was talking to Krista about it. I was like, good weather out there, and, got a thing stuck in my foot. What? A piece of metal on the side of the foot, no big deal. Her first instinct, though, was to say, we need to get some Neosporin, or we need to doctor it up, make sure you don't get tetanus, lockjaw, or maybe lockjaw would be good, actually, because you talk too much. But she didn't say all that. This is imaginary, that part is. But her first instinct was to nurture, to take care of. My first instinct was like, the yard's got to get weed-eated. I mean, I got to finish. I can't slow down. So I was like, no, I got to go. And I went and continued. So there's big differences between the way a man thinks and the way a woman thinks, although I'm still unclear on a lot of that side. Another one that I've noticed is we have a baby in the house now, and he's getting a little bit older and a little bit louder. And so when he starts screaming, Krista and I do a really similar hand motion. She goes like this, here, give him to me. And I go like this, here, let me give him to you. So her natural instinct is to nurture, to love, to show compassion and warmth. My first instinct is like, I don't think I finished weed eating. I got to go. I got to get out of here. So we're just really different. And we notice that on pretty much a daily basis. Now, our marriage is really fun. And I use that word intentionally because we really enjoy just being together. We really like our life. And our marriage is not all that stressful. And in fact, for us, what our marriage is it's sort of a relief from the stress that just comes in life. But we've had our moments, just like you. And often, when we have our moments, part of what we're forgetting is the difference between our respective spouse. And so what I want to do is I want to show you a couple of verses that come up a lot when we start talking about marriage. Now, we're going to look at the whole verse in a minute, but I want to just show you these two little bits. Now, this is Paul speaking to his friends in Colossae, many of which were married. And so he says this to him. He says, submit to your own husbands. And then he says, love your wives. Now, what we learn from that is pretty simple. It's that wives and husbands have different needs. They need different things. Now, we kind of already know that, but Paul is confirming it here. He doesn't tell the wife and the husband to do the same thing for each other. Instead, he gives them different instructions. So if you're a husband, your wife needs something different than what you need. Now, he mentions submission is what the husband needs. Wives need love. And so the needs are very different. Now, some of them might overlap, but we see from what Paul's getting at is that those needs are different. Now, what happens when someone doesn't get what they need? Well, he goes on in verse 19, and he says this, do not be bitter toward them. Now, specifically here, he's talking to the husbands, but this applies for the wife as well. So what he's revealing to us is that if those needs are not met, we're in danger of getting bitter. We're in danger of coming into this sphere of bitterness. And guess what bitterness is? Part of bitterness comes from stress. If you're stressed in your marriage and you don't deal with it, you don't take care of it, you just bottle it up, eventually, it's very likely you're going to become bitter. Now, Paul specifically says this to the husbands, so husbands might be at a higher risk of bitterness. I don't know. He doesn't really explain why he says it just to the husbands, but we know that there are wives who become bitter as well. And so this is all something that we need to deal with. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you a bitter, stressed out marriage. And it's not a picture of me or anything. It's just, I'm going to show you a diagram. And this is a stressful, bitter marriage. Now, what I want to do is take what we were learning from what Paul's saying and kind of flip it upside down. And when we start to do this, you're going to probably recognize the kind of things we're going to see in this. So the first thing that we discovered is that husbands' needs and wives' that maybe should be a V. Wives' needs are different. They're different. So I put them in separate boxes so that we can kind of keep it straight that those are different things. Now, they might overlap in certain places, but they're different. Now, specifically, the one that Paul mentions is this. He mentions that the husbands need submission and the wives need love. Now, wives might need, other things. Husbands might need other things. But these are the ones that Paul mentions. So we know these are at the top of the list. These are priority. So we see these differences. We see that husbands and wives have these different needs. Now, let me show you what causes bitterness or stress in a marriage. Husbands take submission from their wives. Now think about that for a second. If a husband needs submission, it'd be very natural for him to enforce submission upon his wife. To enforce this need of his own to say, well, you're supposed to submit to me, so I'm going to make sure that you do. So I'm going to make every other option really uncomfortable until you submit to me. And so he takes forcefully submission from his wife. Now, wives are in danger of this as well. Now, we don't think of this as something bad because we often talk about it sort of in joking tones, but wives can be in this position where they're taking love from their husbands. You say, how could a wife take love from her husband? Well, what you do, what one could do, I don't want to make it personal or anything, but what one could do is make all other options really uncomfortable. Like, if you don't give me the things that I want, if you don't get, like I've done this a number of times, forgotten or neglected to get something on a, on a special day, like, what was the recent one? Mother's Day or on Valentine's Day. If you neglect that or forget that, especially on purpose, then the situation gets uncomfortable, doesn't it? And so that's a way of enforcing love. Like, if you don't show me the love that I want, I'm going to make things very uncomfortable for you. Now, there's a lot of nasty words that we use to describe this situation, but it happens both ways. Now, a lot of times we bash the men for enforcing submission, but we don't really bash the women for enforcing love, because all of our Disney movies tell us that everybody deserves to be loved. There's no movie I'm aware of that says everybody deserves to be submitted to. And so it's just part of our culture to say, hey, this is kind of okay, this is not okay. But I want to rewrite this for you. This is not okay too. This is also a problem. I mean, if you want a less stress marriage, both parties need to realign the way that they do this. They need to redo the way that they operate. I'm sorry I keep pulling at this thing. I've got this cable pulling my ear off back here. I'm just going to yank this way up and we'll see what happens. So here is the question that we have to come to here is, who are you trying to please? Now, in this situation, it's pretty clear if this is going on, sort of this enforcing, if this is going on, basically what is happening is this action is to please the self. I'm trying to please myself when I enforce submission upon my wife. She's trying to please herself if she's forcing me to love her. And so we are doing all of this to please ourselves. Now, this is a stressful, bitter marriage. Now, I'm not going to ask, but I bet if we were being honest, many of us have had at least moments like this, periods in our marriage where we were experiencing something like what we see here. Now, what I want to do is explore these two little verses that Paul gives us that talk about marriage. And by the way, a lot of people avoid these. And in fact, I felt sort of tempted to just kind of push these aside and go to some softer, more fluffy verse in the Bible. But these are really the meat of what Paul is giving as advice for marriage. So it's actually pretty important that we look at what they say. So let's look at the first. Now, what I want you to notice is this first word. It says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord." Now, I want us to kind of put a pin in this part, as is fitting in the Lord. We're going to come back to that. What that tells us is that there's some limits on this. But we're going to come back to that in a minute. The first thing I want us to notice is this word, wives. So, I want to show you what a lot of husbands think this verse says. Now, let me just remind you, wives, but now I'm going to tell you what husbands think this verse says. So notice this mangled version that I've put together. "Husbands, force your wives to submit to you. Don't worry, they'll respect you a whole super duper bunch for it." And that comes from Confusion 3:18, No Sense Translation. Now, of course, I wrote this. But the reason why I wrote this is because I've seen this. I've seen men, Christian men, who are having trouble in their marriage, and this is their natural inclination, right? It's to say, well, look at this verse, honey. It says, "Wives, submit to your husbands." They weaponize this verse. They take it, and they turn it into a ballistic missile. And they launch it at their wives. That's not what this verse says. This verse is not addressed to you husbands. In fact, let's just ask the question, who is the verse addressed to? He puts it in the verse. He says, "Wives, submit to your husbands." Now imagine this for a second, husbands. If you force your wife to submit, you are stealing her opportunity to obey this in good conscience. You make it more difficult if you try to force her to submit. You see, this is between her and God. And as a husband, it is not my job to make my wife do what this verse says. Now that's hard, but I'm going to repeat it. Husbands, it is not our job to make our wives submit to us. That's not what this verse says, and I don't see that in the Bible. So, "Wives, submit to your own husbands" is like mail addressed to wives only, not husbands. Let me just illustrate this. I got this neighbor, and he's a good neighbor. But let's just imagine for a second that I had a problem where I like to go and open his mailbox and go through his mail. It's a felony, by the way, don't do that. But let's just say that was my problem. I like to go through his mail. And I would go through and I look in this hypothetical situation, which isn't real, I promise. In this hypothetical situation, I go through his mail and I find his electric bill. And I realize, he owes $100. So I go to his door, I knock on his door, and I say, "Listen, neighbor, you better pay this electric bill." Is that any of my business? No, that's between him and the electric company. And if I get involved, I'm just messing the whole thing up. Now, when he pays his electric bill, he's going to think about how mean I am. He's going to think about how weird I am, and he's probably going to call the cops. Now, if you're a husband, let's be careful about this. Because this is mail addressed to our wives. And if we get involved in this situation, trying to enforce this, then we mess the whole situation up. We then make it a bitter moment when they do submit to us. Because if you enforce submission, you are tinkering in something that is between your wife and God. So, husbands, I'm just gonna tell you, I don't like giving commands or anything, but this is just what I see in this verse. Husbands, stop trying to take submission from your wives. It's not what the Bible tells us to do. It's not what we're supposed to do. So what I want to do is try to kind of untangle this mess that we have, okay? So this is the stressful, well, the bitter disappeared, but this is the stressful marriage. It's probably bitter too, but this is a stressful marriage, and this was what we talked about. But here's what we're seeing is that husbands shouldn't be taking submission from their wives. They shouldn't be enforcing that, right? Now, we haven't fixed the problem other than to say this is step one. This isn't the end of the issue, but this is the beginning. This is the first step. Husbands, we've got to stop trying to enforce submission, even if it's just through light manipulation. I'll tell you how I do it. Just honest moment here. The way that I find myself doing this is by my attitude. That if there's something that I don't like, then I just get a bad attitude, and suddenly my entire environment begins to change around me. The kids get a little quieter. My wife begins to try harder to please me. And so that's a type of manipulation. That's a way of getting submission, not only from my wife, but from my kids too, by just adjusting, by just being grumpy. And so that is something that the Bible doesn't tell us to do. Now, there's a whole range of ways that we can do this and really mess this whole situation up, but we have to be careful. So, now what I want to do, we've talked a lot about the husbands, but I want to take a look at what is said to the husbands specifically, and then we're going to talk to the wives. So this one says, husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them. That's Colossians 3:19. Now, you probably already kind of know where we're going with this, but let's just take a look at what a lot of wives think this verse says. Now, wives, I heard you laughing pretty good when we were talking about the husband, so, be a good sport. Let's just see what this mangled version says. Wives, force your husbands to love you more by nagging them about all of their mistakes. Don't worry, it won't make them bitter. That's Confusion 3:19. Oh, way less laughter on that one. Now, I used a nasty word in here, nagging. I know. But I use that because that's the extreme version of it. Now, all of you are lovely, and I'm sure nobody in this room does it. But this is the extreme version. And we can feel our flesh kind of moving in this direction if we're not careful. So as we use this kind of extreme version, I want us to remember the same thing that we said to the husbands. Who is this verse addressed to? It's right there. It's husbands. This rule still applies here. And so if your husband is not treating you the way that you want, I'm going to tell you, it will backfire if you try to force them to love you. You cannot force someone to love you. Now, you can force someone to go through the motions by making all other options awful for them, but it's still not giving the desired result. And so we shouldn't be in the business of trying to force our spouse, whether you're a husband or a wife. We shouldn't be in the business of trying to force our spouse to give us what we need. So what we see here is, wives, stop trying to take love from your husbands. Now, let's kind of unwind this thing a little bit more. What we see here is the same thing. We need to stop that motion. We need to stop, wives need to stop trying to take love. Husbands need to stop trying to take submission. Here's another way of saying it. Husbands should not try to enforce submission. Wives should not pressure husbands to love more. Now, you might say, well, isn't there something I can do? Yes, there are some things that you can do to make it easier for your spouse to do what she or he is supposed to. But this isn't it. And this will backfire. And this will result in a stressed out, bitter marriage if you try to force the situation. Now, what I want to do is go back to these verses once again. Is this our third time to look at them? We're going to look at them for a third time. We're going to focus on the actual actions that Paul tells us as spouses to do. So, the first one is to wives. Now, there's no necessarily priority here. This is just what Paul says first. He says, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, I'm just going to admit, submit is a hard word. I know it. I mean, we all know it. And in fact, what you'll find is people that write books on marriage, Christian books, a lot of times they'll take this word and they'll kind of use a synonym. You've probably seen this. In fact, there's a really famous book, which is a great book, by the way, that instead of throughout the book calling it submission, they call it respect. Now, that's a decent word. That's a good word. We all can get behind that. But let's remember that Paul uses this word. And I don't want to hide from it. I mean, it's a tough word. So let me just give you kind of my thinking on this. So submission doesn't seem to be blind obedience. And the reason why I say that is because in the verses that come right after this, let's see, 19, so it'll be 20, in a couple of verses after this, he actually uses the word obey, but not of wives. He uses the word obey when he's talking about kids obeying their parents and when he's talking about servants obeying their masters. But here he doesn't use that word. He uses a different word. And so what that says to me is it's not the same thing as just blind obedience. He's not saying blindly obey your husband. Okay, so it's somewhere away from blind obedience. But then on the other hand, it's not blind obstinance either. I say, what is blind obstinance? Well, that's a Lucas word, but blind obstinance is when you resist everything your husband tries to tell you to do, or asks you to do, or begs you to do. If you just automatically resist, no matter what it is, because you're upset, because you're bitter, because you're stressed out, that would be blind obstinance. And so submission sits between blind obedience and blind obstinance, somewhere in the middle. And guess what? In my thinking, probably every marriage is going to define this a little bit different. For some husbands, it may mean something a little different for other husbands. Now, Paul had a very specific meaning in mind, and I wish he had written an entire book so we could understand exactly what it is. But that's my thinking on it. It's not blind obedience. There's a responsibility of the wife to be thinking about the kind of things her husband expects her to do, but it's also not blind obstinance either. So, here's what he's saying. Wives, give submission to your husbands. Now, this probably seems really similar to what we were already saying, but I want you to notice this word, give. Now, what I'm saying here is this is a free gift. We said the vows, we made the promises. This is a free gift from a wife to a husband. If your husband is forcing you to submit, then obviously that messes the situation up. So subvert all that by giving submission, by offering it up free, without having to have this tense situation. And here's the reasoning. It's not because you're inferior. It's not because you're less. It's because he needs it. God has designed him to need someone to follow him. I mean, we're just this weak as men. We need people to follow us. We need this relationship where we have leadership. And in our families, this is what we need. And so, wives, I'm going to suggest that you stop thinking about submission as something that is being taken from you, but something that you can give for the health of your husband. He needs it. To be the man that God has designed him to be in this marriage, he needs it. So, how would this look on our diagram? Well, husbands need submission. We already kind of marked this out, but let's just kind of replace this so that it can kind of make sense to us. So here, wives need love, but it's not necessarily love that they give. Now, you could say they give what is needed because they love, but just go with me here. So wives need love, but what they're told to give is submission. And so the way that they love their husbands is by giving this free gift of submission to their husbands. And so it's not the same thing that's needed. Now, I bet you can kind of see where this is going. Let's look at this next verse from Paul. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them. So it's pretty simple. Husbands, give love to your wife. Husbands, this is a free gift. It's not just, I'll give her love and affection if she's nice to me. It's not just, I'll give her love and affection on date night because it's scheduled. It's not just, I'm gonna love her as long as things are good, but I'm gonna ignore her and be in the bat cave for the rest of the week if things are tense. I mean, as men, that's what we kind of want to do. We want to run away. We want to go, to our own space. We want to go weed eat the yard or whatever it is. But she needs love. And let's remember that's why we give love, not for ourselves, but for them. Because God has designed your wife to need love, to need affection. And for her to be the wife and potentially the mother, if you have kids, that God has designed her to be, she needs your love. And so you give it as a free gift because you promised you would. You said the vows. Well, I did too. We said the vows. And this is our instruction. No matter how she's treating you, you give love. Wives, it's the same way for both of us. So, here's what it looks like. Husbands need submission to function in the way that God has called us to function, but what we need to give is love. Wives need love, but what husbands need is submission. So wives give submission. Now, this is starting to look a little bit like a less stress marriage. Now, we're not quite done, Because there's another thing that needs to shift. Earlier we said all of this happens for our own pleasure. I'm trying to please myself, and so I do all of this as a husband or all of this as a wife. So the question becomes, who are you trying to please? Well, now in a less stressed marriage, it might look something like this. Instead of pleasing myself, I'm trying to please my spouse. Now I'm just going to admit to you, this isn't the end. This isn't the end of what we're trying to learn today, but this is a sort of a stepping stone. And even if you're an unbeliever, let's say you're just visiting here trying to check this Jesus thing out, and you're married, even if you're an unbeliever, the things we're talking about here can still improve your marriage. Now, I tend to think that being a believer, having the Holy Spirit is going to make things even easier, making them better, but this is just practical stuff. I mean, this is what Paul is giving us. It's just practical. And so what we're seeing here is that the key to a less stressed marriage, at least so far, is this. Stop trying to take what you want and start giving what your spouse needs. Now, that's a different mindset. That is a totally different mindset than what I'm thinking on a normal Saturday. What I'm thinking on a normal Saturday is, how do I get time alone? How do I get away from the chaos and the noise that the kids create, or whatever it is? And wherever you are in your place in life, it's probably something different. But we need to shift that thinking into giving our spouses what they need. So this is our bottom line. Now you'll notice that there's still a line missing, and we're going to build that in just a second. But here's what we have so far. When you're stressed because of marriage, fulfill your spouse's needs. Now I think that's pretty easy to remember. Not necessarily always easy to do, but I think it's pretty easy to remember. That when you're stressed out because of your marriage, fulfill your spouse's needs. Isn't that different than what we normally do? I mean, when I'm feeling stressed out, my normal instinct is to fight, to explain my position calmly and with fury that's buried deep inside that nobody sees. But this is a different mindset. What if, as soon as things start getting tense, I start thinking, what does she need right now? What is she wanting to hear from me? Maybe an I love you grenade right in the middle of this war would really take care of things. What does your spouse need? Now, what if I do the best I can and still can't have the marriage I want? Let's just be honest. There's no magic button here. And while we're in a fallen world, marriages are probably still going to be difficult. And so there are certain situations where we do everything we can and still the marriage is a wreck, or it's stressful, or it's bitter. And so what do we do? Well, beautifully, Paul gave us just a little bit right at the end of this section. And so we're going to kind of finish up with this because it really puts a nice bow on what we're talking about. So after he talks about wives and husbands and talks about the rest of the family, Paul lays this on us. This shows up in chapter 3, 23 through 24. He says, whatever you do. Now, he's just been talking about marriage, okay? So marriage is most certainly included. Now, this applies to everything we do, but he's talking about marriage and the family, so he's focused on that. He says, whatever you do, do it from the heart. I think I have a heart. I'm not sure. As a husband, it's in question. But what he's saying is, it doesn't literally mean your blood pump. He means do it as if it matters. Do it with compassion. Do it with love. He says, do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people. Now, if you're like me, I like people to be pleased with what I'm doing. I'm a bit of a people pleaser. And so I find myself sometimes getting my own motivations mixed up in this people-pleasing thing. And what he's saying is we need to shift who we're trying to please. We need to shift from trying to please other people into trying to please the Lord. Now, the action may look the same, but the mindset is completely different. And this applies even in our marriages. Now, earlier we said a less stressed marriage is where we're trying to please the other person. But as you know, that comes with some problems. Even though we try to please other people, sometimes we're still going to be let down. And so he gives us this great thing where he says that what we ought to be doing is trying to please the Lord. And then he tells us why. He says, knowing that you will receive the reward of an inheritance from the Lord, you serve the Lord Christ. Now, I think it's fair to say that there are wives out there who look at this word submission and say, well, I'm not his servant. And this verse says, yeah, you're right. You're not his servant. You're the Lord's servant. And by the way, your marriage is temporary. You'll be dead soon. It's okay. But for now, we need to serve the Lord. So remember that. You're not your husband's servant. You're the servant of the Lord. And the Lord has put you in this situation for now, temporarily, and he's going to reward you for it. He's going to give you the reward of the inheritance. Now, if you're a husband, the same thing is true. I'm not good at affection. I have a real problem with being vulnerable. I don't know how to do this. Well, figure it out, because you're serving the Lord when you do it. Think about that for a second. Every time you say, honey, I love you, you just served the Lord. Oh, and by the way, there's a reward for it. It's amazing. Christ is watching our marriages, and he's eager to reward how we treat each other. And so the mindset then changes. I'm no longer thinking about, I'm just trying to please my wife, because that could be an endless task if you're trying to please your husband or trying to please your wife. But the Lord is who I ought to be trying to please. So who are you trying to please? Well, in our previous version, we said that this kind of practical version is to please each other. But guess what? A God-pleasing marriage looks a little different. We do the same types of things. We give submission, we give love, but the way we think about it is different. We do it day in and day out because we know that it pleases the Lord, and there will be a reward for it. Now, I like rhyming phrases, and I want to kind of tie this all up with just something that kind of maybe you can remember. So for wives, this one's for you. If I please my man, I'll get let down. If I please the Lord, I get reward. I think you can remember that, right? If you set your goal on trying to please your man, you're going to be let down eventually. Now, hopefully it goes good sometimes. But if that's your main goal, eventually you're going to be let down. But if you set your sights on pleasing the Lord is easier to please than your husband. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way by the way some people preach, but the Lord is easy to please. He told you what to do, and if you do it, he'll be pleased. Now, here's one for the husbands. I know, husbands, you don't like poetry, so this one's a tough one. If I please my wife, I get more strife. Hopefully not all the time, but sometimes it happens, right? If I please my wife, I get more strife. If I please the Lord, I get reward. If we spend our time trying to please another person, even the best person on the planet, we're still going to get let down sometimes. But if we please the Lord, if we refocus the way that we do our marriages, then not only can we please the Lord, but he will reward us. So, make the Lord pleased by fulfilling your spouse's needs. So, this is what a God-pleasing marriage looks like. The husband needs submission. The husband gives love, and he does it to please God. The wife needs love, and she gives submission in order to please God. So our bottom line, let's put this new line in because I think it ties it all up pretty nice. When you're stressed because of marriage, make the Lord pleased by fulfilling your spouse's needs. Now, as a quick reminder, I want to show you where we started at the very beginning of this. The place we started was that husbands need submission, and they take submission. Wives need love, and they take love. And all of this to please ourselves. But let's please the Lord. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word, and sometimes just the simplicity of it. And Lord, I pray that we could do this. I tend to think that marriage is a great way to demonstrate the faith in the world. We know of so many marriages that are just in trouble, stressed out, and bitter. And Lord, I pray that we would be able to work on our marriages with the idea that it represents you, that it represents the kind of love and the kind of submission and the kind of service and the kind of sacrifice that you gave for us on the cross. Lord, I pray that we would be able to build God-honoring and God-pleasing marriages. In your name I pray. Amen. Thank you, guys.
I need your word to hold me now, need you to pull me through. I need a miracle.